you, Professor Patrick Lee. Thank you, Professor Cynthia B. Cohen and Professor Altacharo. Don't all leave yet. This is your chance to ask questions and to pose your own concerns. So if you have an issue that you would like to raise with any of us, that would be, there will be students going down the aisles handing out microphones.
Thank you very much. My question is, the issue of abortion is extremely emotionally charged. A lot of money is spent to attempt to reverse the current law. It's a huge issue. I think that I see the same sort of emotion and spending of energies on this stem cell issue. I have a family member. They're pro-life. I would say probably to the extreme. I think they're pretty nervous about stem cell research and this sort of notion of playing God. And they have 3 children, all by in vitro fertilization. And if you remove the abortion issue, and if you suddenly say to all parties, stem cell research has been a failure, it's not going to work as a medical therapy. It's a poor research tool. And so the only issue left on the table is that a woman is superovulated, you collect 10 eggs, you fertilize them, and suddenly you have 3, and you've given birth to 3 children. You still have that issue of destruction of those embryos. And so my question is, if that's the only issue left on the table, is there going to be this whole groundswell of opposition to that alone? I say if the abortion issue were gone, and if stem cell research were gone, then the arguments in favor of restricting stem cell research seem to me solely on the basis of destroying these out-of-body embryos.
If I may, it has come to the attention of many people that we are suffering from a bit of a national amnesia about IVF in the way in which we debate stem cell research. Because you're absolutely right. IVF is a technique that is bound to create more embryos than can be used. And therefore, it is bound to create a supply of embryos that are going to wind up either being left frozen to the point of unusability or destroyed at the behest of the people who made them. And those people who have advocated that we stop embryonic stem cell research have rarely been equally fervent in advocating that we stop IVF as a treatment for infertility. And that's interesting. I mean, in the 1980s, when IVF was first introduced, it was the subject of some very passionate criticism and calls for it to be criminalized and banned, precisely because it results in abandoned or destroyed embryos. But as more and more people found that there was a member of their family who had conceived using IVF, and as it became more and more part of the fabric of American life, it began to be tolerated to the point that there really wasn't any belief that there was the political ability to ban it any longer. That said, we do have a legislator here in Wisconsin. I don't know if he's still in the legislature, and I believe it was from the Senate, last name Freeze, who actually did a number of years ago introduce a bill that was going to ask that we look at the IVF sector in Wisconsin, because at least he did see that there was a commonality in his concerns, and he wanted to attract attention to that fact. But by and large, as a matter of pure politics, you couldn't get IVF banned, even though it results in the destruction of embryos, because too many people simply want it. It's too much a part of modern medicine.
In vitro fertilization raises another one of those balancing acts that Altacharo referred to with respect to the abortion debate. Many people who are anti-abortion make an exception for rape and incest and the life and even serious threats to the health of the mother. which raises the question as to whether or not they genuinely consider the fetus to be morally equivalent to one of their born children. The 400,000 or so embryos which are cryopreserved, that is frozen, some of them have serious genetic conditions which, if they were implanted and gestated, would be expressed in some cases in ways incompatible with life, or incompatible with a life which has got a minimum quality. The question that arises for those who believe that an embryo is morally equivalent to a child, whether or not the right thing to do with those embryos which do have those genetic predispositions to Tay-Sachs or to spina bifida or to other genetically controlled conditions, whether or not the right thing to do with those embryos is to implant them, have a woman gestate them, and have them treated in an intensive care unit. I suspect many people would find that to be ill-advised, to create thousands and thousands of very sick children from embryos which are currently in cold storage. If that's the way a person feels, I think we have another one of those situations where we have to balance our concern with the sanctity of human life with our concern with avoiding suffering occurring in other spheres of life.
I would say that the excesses of IVF, which are to get all these eggs at once, fertilize them all, only insert a few, is a reflection of what nature does. I mean, out of every pregnancy, at most 3 out of 10 pregnancies survive. I mean, that's nature's way of allowing life to continue, as everything's done in excess, and physicians know this, and that's why I'm sure that's why they thought, well, let's just fertilize 10 or 10 eggs at one time to save the woman from suffering, knowing full well that most pregnancies never come to fruition. So, I mean, that's something that's not mentioned a lot here, but everything in nature is in excess, with the idea of getting one healthy baby out of numerous pregnancies, most of which you would never know existed because people just have a period that's 2 weeks late. The embryos that are being used in IVF or for stem cell research are embryos you probably would never have known existed if you weren't retrieving them and creating all this in the lab. So I don't think the medical community has as much concern about some of these issues because they know about all the pregnancies that women just naturally lose.
There's an interesting article that's going to be published soon in the American Journal of Bioethics that takes up this thread of conversation about the early embryo and excess embryos, and says, if you go back to your point that 75% of embryos don't make it, I believe, is it past the first 2 weeks or all told? I'm not clear which it is. The writer of this article says you have a terrible Holocaust going on here if you think that all embryos are human individuals from the moment of conception, and yet you're doing absolutely nothing about trying to save them, rather than have the NIH doing research on all of these diseases that, affect some people, but not the percentage of people as those who are affected by conditions that happen in utero. The comparison is nothing. It's a much more serious condition, much more serious circumstance to have all of these human individuals dying during the prenatal period. So we ought to be switching our funding and working to develop cures for these terrible diseases that take their lives. And it's a very interesting argument.
Can I just, a couple of things. Each conference I go to, that estimate gets higher and higher. The embryology text that I've looked at, O'Rahilly, Keith Moore, and Prasad, Larson, Carlson, it's between 45 and 55%.
The most recent statistics are 75%.
These are like 2006, 2007 now. I mean, so it may be up to 75%, but I think there's some speculation, and I've seen between 45 and 55%. Now, you know, whatever the percentage is, it's still a high percentage. Now, a couple of things about that. First, I think it may be that many of those are also have to remember that many of those may be failed fertilizations. In other words, I think if the fertilization, I'm not saying every genetic defect results in a non-human being, but I think if the genetic defect is so severe that you don't have, as I was talking about before, you don't have a being that has the active disposition to develop itself to a stage where it can reason and make free choices. If you don't have that, then you don't have a whole human being. So I think in many of these cases, I mean, we do know that some of these are so severely the fertilization is so failed that you don't have a whole human being. And I don't know what the percentage. I don't know if we can know what the percentages are on that. So I'm not sure it ends up being as high as one talks about, as one might think. Of course, that does not, even if it were very high, that would not show that those were not human beings. Okay, the question is, what's the intrinsic nature, what kind of being we're talking about there. The excess embryos, I don't think it's true that IVF is necessarily tied to creating excess embryos. In Germany, for example, it is illegal to create so-called surplus or excess embryos. You can have the procedure where you create only one. They'll have other practical difficulties, but if these are human beings, and I think they are, then one ought not to create so-called excess embryos and put them in that state.
I had a question for Dr. Lee. As far as the natural law theory goes, what do you think the best solution is for all of the excess embryos that are in surplus right now?
I don't know if there's just one, solution to that. There are a couple of things to be said. I think that there are some women have volunteered to adopt these children and have brought some babies to term, and those are called snowflake babies. So it is something that can be done. I think the reality, is that these are human beings, and so those mothers and fathers who created these human beings have a responsibility toward them. And just like I have a bunch of kids, and I have a responsibility toward my kids, I try to fulfill that responsibility, and I think I have a moral responsibility to do what I can to do that. That's one reason why I'm here, so that I can sort of part of my job. So I think their mothers and fathers have a responsibility toward them to do what they can. Now, not all of them are in a position to have those babies implanted anymore. And so then what does someone do if they can't, if they're too old to have that baby implanted? What do they do then? I'm not sure what the answer to that question is.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but
Go ahead.
what if those embryos which have, through pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, have been shown to have very serious genetic disease? Do you think that the proper thing to do is to transfer those and to allow them to gestate and then suffer and die within a matter of months?
I don't think that would be wrong. No. I mean, I think it's giving the kid a chance.
So what do you say to
I mean, as a kid, look, I think you just have to go through go through the whole thing, if you grant that these are human beings, okay? You know, these are whole human beings. Then you try to go through, follow the logical consequence from that ethically. Now, I mean, if we were talking about 1-month-old babies, and you knew a bunch of these 1-month-old babies had genetic defects, you wouldn't say, well, no, look, we can't take that baby home because he has a genetic defect. Now, you wouldn't want to say that. So I would say if we're talking about, you know, a 1-month-old baby and he has a genetic defect, it would still be a good thing to take that baby home and take care of him. You know? And the same thing with a frozen embryo, I think.
Well, hello. I wanted to take another perspective on morality. We've only had one perspective that I've heard tonight that's been presented. I'm a certified lay pastor of the Presbyterian Church USA, and we, not all of us, some of us have the perspective that I have. I think it's absolutely immoral to let people die from embryos that are discarded from fertility clinics. My daughter is one of those people that went through fertility treatments, and she would be very happy to use her excess embryos to save someone else's life. I think it is a matter of morality as well. There's just, I cannot in good conscience allow excess embryos that are frozen, or if they were just created recently, to be thrown in the trash and nothing made of them, and that's not an opinion, it's just a fact. It's happening. And if we say this is not happening, we are closing our eyes to reality. So we must accept the fact that reality is occurring and they are thrown in the trash and there's no value made of these embryos. And the other thing we need to remember is that there's no embryos that I'm aware of that are specifically designed for embryonic stem cell research. Instead, for the most part, as far as I understand, most of the embryos are available from fertility clinics. So why can't we make, as a moral issue, something of value out of something that is going to be discarded if we do not accept your premise of the whole thing from the beginning that life begins at birth? I don't agree with that. Life for me begins at the moment that the baby comes out of the mother and the umbilical cord is cut and the baby takes its first breath of air. That for me is a human being. And I don't agree with you. You've only presented one point of view. There is an alternative point of view to the one that you presented.
Let me try and suggest an alternative, not ethical point of view, but metaphysical point of view. And I do think that the philosophy and metaphysics is fundamental here. I agree with Professor Lee that the early embryo does have its own dynamic and is developing in a particular direction. And I also think that the blastocyst is a biological individual. What I'm not so sure about is whether or not it is equivalent to a baby or equivalent to a child. Almost all of the biological structure has to do with the generation of the placenta and the amnion and the other structures which will support the development of the embryo later on. So the entity at 5 weeks may be a distinct biological individual, a placenta, rather than an infant. And that infant or that embryo is something which develops at a later point, at 2 weeks or 14, after 14 days. And that is a way of looking at the transition and early embryological development, which allows us to recognize the importance of fertilization, that clearly is an important threshold, but also to recognize the importance of the first point at which the embryo itself begins to develop. And that is after the point at which stem cells might be derived.
Well, I think you've heard me present several alternative views of the moral significance of the early embryo and how it develops. So we did get a little bit in there, and Alta presented some alternative religious views as well. So in fairness to the conference organizers, we did get some other points of view in there.
Religious views. You did present
Right.
other views.
Yeah.
I didn't present a religious view.
There was only one religious view.
I did not present a religious view.
Well, that's how I see it.
I mean, I did not quote the Bible or any church teaching, so it's not. The idea that it's not a human being until it's pulled out and the umbilical cord is cut, I think surely that's not making a different type of. It's not a human being. It's not a person. It's surely when you pull it out of the womb, that doesn't change its nature. I mean, we could have. Most of these babies you could have induced earlier on, and it would be the same kind of being, but brought out earlier. Let me just, Mark and I were talking about this last night, about the development of the embryo and his idea and the idea that Cynthia discussed, that perhaps it becomes a human being at a later stage. My problem with that, metaphysically, is that it seems to me that you're positing an effect without a cause. My problem is that you can get an effect that's greater than the causes, as it were, if you get two or more causes working together and then they produce something different from themselves. So A and B working together can produce something greater than themselves, I think. That's sort of, there's an old principle that says the effect cannot be greater than the cause. Well, I mean, if you're talking about one cause and one effect, then yeah, the effect cannot be greater than the cause. You can get an effect that's greater than any of the several causes working together. And I think that's what happens when the sperm meets the ovum. You get two causes working together to produce a third thing that's greater than any of them. Now, after that, the problem is, I think what you're doing is, what you have is the unfolding of the potentiality that is within that being. I don't see any extrinsic, there are all sorts of extrinsic causes, factors at work, but all of those extrinsic factors are environment or nutrition. They're being used by this being for its own self-development. So the stage at which the embryo is at day 14 is an effect of the embryo, or that system, whatever you want to call it, at day 13. And the one at day 13 is the effect of that embryo at day 12, and so on back. I'm not arguing just for continuity. What I'm arguing is that it seems to me otherwise the appearance of a new type of thing requires several causes to come together and engender a new thing. And I don't see that happening after fertilization. That's I have a metaphysical problem with that. But okay, now Alta maybe has
I want to,
alternate.
consistent with your comment and following up on your presentation, and knowing that we're coming to a close and you all have been very patient, I would like to suggest that perhaps we could also think about this from a very different point of view. And I'm going to suggest we think about it from the point of view of my cat. Now, my cat, whom I love dearly, and who is named Psycho Kitty, is at home in Madison right now, and she's exceedingly hungry. And she, in my opinion, has a right to be fed because she can experience hunger. She has a preference to not be hungry, and therefore she has an interest in being fed, and therefore I think that in turn triggers a reciprocal duty on my part to feed her. I think she has a right not to be tortured because she can experience pain. I don't think, however, that my cat, to use a ludicrous example, has a right to go to college, both because she can't understand the concept and she can't take advantage of that right if it were offered. Indeed, she doesn't even have a right not to be killed because she doesn't really have a sense of the future beyond mere kind of brute self-preservation when she's being chased by the cat across the street. And I use this silly example just to point out that there is a different way of thinking about entities, because what we've been debating here is something that is all premised upon potentiality and future development, not based upon current capacity. But there's a different way of thinking about rights and duties, and that is that they are tied very much to current capacity. And Dr. Lee alluded to this when he briefly, toward the end of his presentations, mentioned that there's another way of thinking about personhood that is dependent upon self-awareness. But the reason that that theory exists is because there is a notion that you don't have rights until you have preferences. You have to have a preference to be alive in order for it to be wrong for somebody to kill you, because they are now thwarting your legitimate desires. And the fact is that the embryo and the early fetus clearly does not have the capacity to know that it exists, let alone to have a preference for continued existence over having its existence and development cut short. And that's why many people conclude that a live-born child or an adult patient suffering from Parkinson's has entitlements and are people to whom we owe duties that are superior to those entitlements on the part of an embryo or the duties that we might owe it. In some ways, it is very much about point of view. If you take a kind of omniscient point of view and you see things in terms of the past, the present, and the future on a timeline, you may come to the conclusion that potentiality is in fact a trigger for rights and duties. If instead you look at things kind of horizontally and you ask what are people currently, or what is this entity currently capable of wanting, and does that trigger an obligation on our part, at least not to thwart its desires, maybe even to facilitate it, then you come to very different conclusions. Well, what do we do with people who are in comas or asleep? They're not in the same position as an embryo because they used to be awake. They used to be the person who had a desire. And in some ways, the reason we don't kill the person in a coma is not because it would harm them while they're in the coma. They wouldn't know one way or the other. It's the proverbial tree falling in the forest that nobody hears. The reason we don't kill them is because all of us who are currently awake and aware would be living in mortal terror if we feared that every time we went to bed or had a temporary coma, somebody was going to come and kill us, because we do now have an awareness of ourselves and a desire to continue living. So part of what's going on here is a debate about how to pick a point of view from which to build a theory of rights. And what Dr. Lee has presented, whether you view it as religious or otherwise, is a point of view that is built on this longitudinal vision. And I think what you were alluding to, and what I'm certainly trying to describe very poorly because I'm not a philosopher, is a different point of view and leads to very radically different conclusions, both arguments being based on a series of postulates and then deriving logical conclusions.
I suspect that many of us have psycho cats and psycho dogs at home that are waiting for us.
I think that we're opening up a whole other area, because I radically disagree with what Alta is proposing, but we can't possibly get into it at this hour.
I absolutely concede that most people will disagree.
We're going to have to thwart our desires, I suppose.
We're going to have to thwart the desires of philosophers to continue to engage in metaphysics. One last question.
One last question. Is this on? Okay. Actually, there might be a couple questions actually in here, but ultimately I would just like to first express that my argument and the use of this argument requires the ability to integrate both science, spirit, and by doing this you will be acknowledging physical, metaphysical, and the non-physical. First off, I just took a couple notes upon listening to your dictations tonight.
Do we have a question?
And yes, I do actually. It has been thought in recent studies that the pineal gland is or has been called the seat of the soul. And I feel that if we could determine where this gland or when this gland is formed would give us insight into that question, we wonder about when is considered life, how this comes to be. It is my understanding that there has been a shift in consciousness during the 7th week or 49th day when the pineal gland is actually able to be seen within an infant. So if in fact there is this pineal gland in the brain, which at this time, this 49-day period, 7th week, the shift of consciousness occur, is it possible that this bridge, perhaps the pineal gland, otherwise known as the seat of the soul, is a bridge of consciousness which connects us to planes dimensionally other than this third dimension, which could put a framework into exactly when life is actually determined as beginning?
The 49th day is well past the point of embryos.
Oh, I am for your research, sir. I am definitely for it. And I think everything, the only thing I would not be for is if this pineal gland research was looked into, and if the seat of the soul is in its consideration was not acknowledged as this time of life beginning and the soul implanting itself within the person, well then I feel that all children that would be born thus after, even at the initial time of conception, cannot be considered to be thwarted, because I feel the children that will come during a time after this time will be of utmost importance to our civilization and continued humanity of this planet, ultimately.
You may be correct, but
how do you feel about this being?
I think that that's very quickly a view that was associated with the 17th century philosopher Rene Descartes and has been superseded by a number of other views. But it has to do with the nature of consciousness. And maybe next time I'll try and put on a conference on the nature of consciousness. There's a philosophical problem for you. Thank you all for your patience. Good night.